Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog on Mint Press with me, Lowkey. As you know, weekly we are going against the grain, covering stories in a way that the mainstream media would never do. Because of that, we do require your support. So please do support us by liking, subscribing, sharing this video, commenting down below, and also becoming one of our members on Patreon. That would be much appreciated. This week, we are going to look at the latest example of the Israel lobby's war against academia and what is happening at Sheffield University with the Palestinian lecturer Shahd Abusalama. To start with, though, I think it's important for us to have a look at a comment that was recently made by the director of neoliberal think tank, the Institute for Economic Affairs, on LBC.
The British Board of Jewish Deputies, do we think their list of donors should be in the public domain? What could possibly go wrong?
I mean, it's a very compelling answer, but you haven't answered the question, which is who funds you? You haven't named a single
Well, I told you why I won't answer the question. I don't believe that organisations...
isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is revealing. Do you think the list of donors to the British Board of Jewish Deputies should be listed in the public domain?
Are the British Board of Deputies lobbying government ministers on this, that and the other?
Yes.
In the same way that you are in quite a
more so. I mean, much richer than we are. The Church of England, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there we have Mark Littlewood asking clearly if the Board of Deputies in this country would be willing to release the information about who funds them. Well, it's something that here at the Watchdog we have looked into, and we can reveal that one of the funders for the Board of Deputies, this very well-known and active group which militated relentlessly against Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, one of their funders is the Trevor Chin Charitable Trust. We know that Trevor Chin is a key Israel lobbyist in this country and one of the major figures behind Israel lobby group BICOM. Trevor Chin also funds Keir Starmer. In addition to funding the Board of Deputies, he also funds the Jerusalem Foundation and the JNF. Both of these organizations build settlements. The Jerusalem Foundation focusing on East Jerusalem and the JNF across the West Bank and Palestine 48 build settlements. In addition to that, we found another organization by the name of the Cat Atkin Puss Willow Foundation. It also funds the Board of Deputies. But who else does the Cat Atkin Puss Willow Foundation fund? It also funds the Jerusalem Foundation, the builder of settlements, and the Conservative Foundation, which is the instrument through which the Conservative Party in this country is funded. In addition to that, the Cat Atkin Puss Willow Foundation funded the Quilliam Foundation, the now defunct and ultimately discredited organization which pushed mythology about Muslims in this country. Another organization that funds the Board of Deputies is the Jewish Leadership Council. The Jewish Leadership Council also funds BICOM, the Israel lobby group. The Board of Deputies, according to reports, were essential alongside the JLC in lobbying the British government to change the law on universal jurisdiction, thus protecting Israeli ministers and generals suspected of war crimes when they visit the United Kingdom in 2011. We also know that the vice president of the Board of Deputies, Gary Mond, in the last month had to step down because he was discovered to have made very racist, anti-Muslim comments on his social media. And the Charity Commission have confirmed that they have an ongoing case looking into the JNF, which is another organization he is a major figure at in relation to the conduct of this trustee. We also know that the Board of Deputies were essential in the process of rewriting the Pearson's textbook used by GCSE students in this country and slanting it heavily in favor of the Israeli regime. The exact employee of the Board of Deputies who worked on that was Talia Ingelebi, who identifies herself as an Israeli on her Twitter and is the International Relations Officer of the Board of Deputies. Alongside them, the UK Lawyers for Israel also worked on that case. Now, an interesting thing about the Board of Deputies is throughout the Corbyn years, if one was to suggest that this organization had a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy, then you would no doubt be suspended and probably expelled from the Labour Party. However, in their 2020 trustees report, the Board of Deputies themselves said clearly the following sentence: "We have a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy in the UK and strengthen links with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and the IDF." And as we said, Gary Mond was simultaneously Senior Vice President at the Board of Deputies and also the Honorary Treasurer and Trustee of the JNF, which builds settlements. Also, in addition to that, you have at the Board of Deputies the Director of Public Affairs, Philip Rosenberg, who previously worked for the British Ministry of Defence and the FCO, the British Foreign Office. As I said, with Talia Inglebi, the international relations officer there, she studied her master's at King's College in Intelligence and International Security. The title of her dissertation was "Mowing the Grass, Israel's Alternate Counterinsurgency Strategy." And we found on Twitter that she has actually used the N-word in her communications. So that is a glimpse into the Board of Deputies and what it is about as an organization. Unfortunately, it has massive sway with the political system in our country. And as we know, Keir Starmer has actually coordinated with it in terms of expulsions from the Labour Party. But today we are here to talk about another part of the Israel lobby's campaign in this country, and that is the academic side of it. So to step into that, we would start by introducing Shahd Abusalama, academic, lecturer, activist from Gaza, currently here in the UK, as far as I understand, about to finish her PhD. Shahd, please introduce yourself, let us know who you are and how you came to be the brilliant person that you are.
Thank you so much, Lowkey. I was born and raised in Gaza, a third generation refugee in Jabalia refugee camp, which is considered Palestine's largest refugee camp. And I was born to a family of fighters, but also of victims of Israel's ethnic cleansing campaigns. My grandparents were ethnically cleansed in 1948, expelled under Zionist fire. One of my grandmothers lost her father in those horrific events where the international community saw us being completely depopulated, massacred, imprisoned in our masses and made refugees, and done nothing but worked towards legitimating the Israeli state and competed to recognize the legitimacy of that newly built state on our ruins, on the ruins of our homeland. And my father was born 40 years after the Nakba to a dispossessed family, obviously, who never managed to return. And he was born and raised at extreme poverty. That was a common, basically, the common feature of the experience of Palestinian refugees after the Nakba. And then in 1967, when he was, in 1967, he was 15 years old, and he was one of the first political prisoners under the occupation that continues until today. So he was 15 then when he experienced his first imprisonment, and that lasted 2 or 3 months. But then he was back in jail in 1972. He was 19 years old, and he was subject to severe torture. My father was just an activist, you know, and like most Palestinians living under occupation and having to deal with the daily injustices, he of course he had to speak loud against these systematic crimes that he witnessed, and he lost family members and all that. Actually, just before his imprisonment, he had lost his cousin who had the same name as my dad, Ismail, and he was just a few years older than my dad, and he was killed when he was basically stuck in a road that has an end. So like they could have, you know, arrested him and that's it, and spared his life, because he was stuck. He had nowhere to actually escape to, my dad's cousin. But they still killed him in cold blood. And that was very devastating event for my dad at his early age. And so ever since, he was a mobilizer. He was active in the community, and he did nothing really except joining the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. But that, you know, any organization, any Palestinian liberation organization is deemed terrorist by the occupying power. And this is ridiculous, of course. Like, where do you start to actually expose the hypocrisy of this? Because, you know, as Palestinians living under occupation, we have a right to resist. And my dad was barely 19, and he had never caused any harm to anyone. He was just like doing, you know, what is within in his power to empower his people and to further their aspirations for freedom, justice, and equality. And at that time, Felicia Langer, a very prominent anti-Zionist Israeli German lawyer, defended him and his comrades, and she met him a few months after his arrest, when he was still under torture, investigation, incredible treatment. And she told, my father told her, like, some of his earliest quotes are basically kept in her own book that she calls With My Own Eyes. And that was published in 1973 in Israel, in Hebrew originally, and then published again in English in 1975. And in his records, he tells Felicia Langer about his loss, the devastating loss of his cousin. And he tells her about how he grew up witnessing children killed in the street, houses being bombarded with Israeli forces. Our own home, you know, our family home was invaded so many times. You're not safe in the streets, in your schools, in your homes. You're not safe anywhere under occupation. And at that time, we have to remember that the nature of the occupation in Gaza was a settler colonial occupation. So the settlers and the troops were rising increasingly in Gaza, and even Ariel Sharon, who led the so-called pacification campaign against the Gaza Strip, one of the most brutal episodes of history that were waged against the Gaza Strip in the early 1970s, during which my father was imprisoned. He was also living in one of these settlements bordering the Gaza Strip. And he saw with his own eyes the policy of breaking bones, literally breaking bones. They were practicing this policy and the policy of shoot to kill, and just all sorts of terror that you could think of. Like, it's really shocking. And when he was in prison, he was also under heavy psychological torture. For example, he told Felicia Langer that he was under torture. He was threatened that if he didn't talk, I don't know talk about what, but if he didn't talk, he would be punished to Amman, where he would be killed. And we know that so many Palestinian activists were killed beyond our occupied territories. And my father then, despite his very young age, teenager, despite that he pled not guilty, despite not having any evidence against him, no fair trial, nothing. And of course, like, this is a military apartheid justice system where the judges are literally soldiers in a judge uniform. So of course the Palestinians will not get any justice under that system. And he defended himself with so much pride, and he didn't. He continued to plead not guilty, and despite that, the persecutor demanded the highest punishment, and they thought that they are actually merciful for not demanding a death penalty against my father and his comrades. And Felicia, in her records, she speaks about how the communists in Palestine had the worst punishment and the worst forms of torture at that time. And my father's case basically testifies to this. And eventually, my father, at age 19, he was sentenced to 7 lifetimes plus 10 years, which with each lifetime equaling 99 years. This is very important to understand, because if this sentence continued to hold, then I wouldn't have existed. None of my family could have existed. My father would have ended, in prison, with Israeli prisons being his graves and the grave of his comrades. And it's just like, these are the stories that I grew up with. These are the stories that mark my birthday and our family celebrations for my parents' anniversary, wedding anniversary, and all that. So my father's life sentences were suspended in 1985 when the resistance managed to brook a prisoners' exchange. And yeah, so that's how my father came to be released. However, my father was never free. I mean, we are free you know, in how we continue to speak. We don't allow fear to get under our skin. We don't allow Israeli oppression to dehumanize us, and we continue to hold on our humanity under these systematically dehumanizing situations. So in that regards, we are free, and we are free in fighting oppression. But in the same time, Israel's oppression continued to chase my dad and my family for so long. And so since his release in 1985, precisely the 25th of May, that is until now continues to be an annual celebration in my family, he was imprisoned 3 times under administrative detention. And this is an order that is practiced arbitrarily against the population, the Palestinian population, in massive quantities. And it's an order that allows Israel to hold detainees without charge, without trial, based on secret information that neither the lawyer or the prisoner himself has access to. So, like, how can the prisoner defend themselves? And this order as well can be renewed. It is up to 6 months, but it can be renewed indefinitely. And this is what happened with Khadr Adnan. This is what happened with Hana Shalabi. All these prisoners that undertook that hunger strike revolution against the brutality of administrative detention. When I came to life, literally, Lowkey, imagine this. My mom had to bring me to life while carrying a white cloth that we are bringing Shahd in peace. At that time, Jabalia refugee camp was under curfew and siege. And under curfew, under military curfew, the Israeli army is indoctrinated to shoot any moving being. And there was no electricity. In the middle of the night, my mom's labor came. My father, luckily, was still free then, but he could have risked his life if he accompanied my mom under those circumstances. So my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, Tamam, who's like a role model for me, she accompanied my mom, holding a lantern in one hand and a white cloth in the other, as they powered through the alleys of the dark alleys of Jabalia refugee camp. 1 kilometer between our home and the nearest clinic, the nearest UN clinic. And in that journey of death, like, they were literally dealing with deadly consequences. We're talking about a white cloth, you know, and my mom going to labor with a white cloth. And despite that, despite the pain, the evident pain that she was into bringing me, the Israeli soldiers still entertained, stopping them, harassing them, pointing a gun at my mom's belly. And this is one of the first experiences of me in life. This is like the story of my birth, you know. A month later, the Israeli forces in their dozens break into our home in a night raid. 2 a.m., terrorize the whole family, hit my grandmother, my mom, stepping in the way between my father and the soldiers to protect their loved ones. And they have just flipped everything upside down. and stole our family albums, my dad's diaries. And eventually, they kidnapped my father and continued to beat him up the whole way until prison. And they took him then for 6 months again. And he was released. And ever since, like, this danger, this fear of persecution, of loss was always, haunting my family. It's a nightmare that, like, you could be at home and you could find Israeli occupation soldiers right inside your home, threatening the safety of your own family members, hitting you. They don't care about, women in the house, children in the house. They don't care about anything. So, and I came, I was like all other refugees. I went to UN schools and lived under the horrors of the first Intifada and then the second Intifada. By the time the second Intifada erupted, I was only 9 years old, but these were some of my most vivid memories. This is like my childhood. And at that time, often our education would be disrupted, invasions so nearby, loss and mourning is just always present. This fear of death is also always present. So, and I grew up under these circumstances, and despite that, I excelled in my education because my father, given his sentence, his long sentence, and Israel's chasing of him ever since he was a child, he never had a chance to get proper education. He was self-taught. He spent a total of 15 years in jail, but he spent a lot of them working on himself and learning and reading. And there is an organized society within Israeli prison. And that is in itself an act of resistance. So for him to compensate, he was trying to empower his children to make us, against all odds, get the best education he could offer. And we like rose from these circumstances. And I managed to finish my BA in Gaza after surviving 3 large-scale military offensives against the Gaza Strip. First, the rains of summer, the rains being a metaphor for missiles falling on our heads in the heat of summer. That was 2006. And then Castled, what they called Castled, in 2008, 2009. I was 17 and I was holding my midterm tawjihi exams. These are the very critical year, in our education. It's the separating between high school and university. And I was doing that. And at 11 a.m., while we were still holding, the morning shift was still holding exams and finishing, and the evening shift is on their way to school. It's like the rush hour. And that day will never, ever disappear from my memory. I will never forget it. It felt like the end of the world. Everything was falling apart. Explosives in their tons fell during the first hours of the attack. And the attack lasted for 22 days. And during these 22 days, there were people, they were part of my daily life. I would see them in the morning, expect to see them in the evening, but then they're just dead, killed. for no offense other being Palestinian. And this is the indiscriminatory attacks that we're dealing with, that is targeting our children, our women, journalists, nurses, paramedics. There's like no red lines. All red lines are crossed under these attacks.
And Shahd, a key thing here is the theme of education. So in the case of your father, in the case of yourself, you see education as having a liberatory presence. But also, in addition to that, we know that your aunt actually had, while teaching in a camp in Gaza, a campaign against her by an organization called UN Watch, which we have some research on and we will talk about in a second. But could you just tell me what that campaign against your aunt consisted of? This is literally the Israel lobby reaching in to a refugee camp in Gaza, to a school which is teaching Palestinian children, and lobbying for the dismissal of a teacher there. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, my maternal aunt, Khalt Mdallala, she's one of the role models of my life. I'm so lucky to have grown up around her. She's like literally a freedom fighter, one of the strongest women voices in the Gaza Strip, a mobilizer, a galvanizer. She very, very active in the women's movement since the beginning of history. And she worked so hard on herself in order to empower her communities. And I remember she was like a mother of already 6 kids when she continued to have her master's degree. And at that time, she had these ambitions to become, to move from being just a teacher to become head of a school. And against all odds, she became the head of a school. And of course, as refugees, we are aware of how the UN is part and parcel of the continuing injustice waged against us. And there is a systematic erasure of our history from our own curriculums. And so the role of the teachers in this context is very, very important and cannot be underestimated, because they are the ones that fill the gap that is erased in our curriculums. So, for example, we are not taught about the Nakba in our school books. Like basic things are, basic things that are so integral to understanding our current impasse and dilemma, our how to move forward, where we come from, basic things. It's actually the teachings of our families and our teachers that kept us rooted in our history. But without them, this history would have gone. And so the only thing that my auntie has done, she went to teaching with this conviction that we have to continue instilling the values of justice and freedom in our children, and keep on reminding them where they come from. Currently, we have the 4th generation of Palestinian refugees who are still denied return to our dispossessed land in 1948. And the way for a way of fighting back is to continue teaching those kids that we come from. I come, for example, from Beit Jirja and Ishdud, and other people would come from Haifa, from Yafa, from Asqalan, from all these 531 villages and towns that were dispossessed and ethnically cleansed in 1948. And this is where we come from, and we shouldn't forget that. And that's the only thing that my auntie does. And it's thanks to the effort of the teachers, the Palestinian teachers, that we haven't forgotten. And we shouldn't forget that the Zionists vowed that the old would die and the young will forget. But here we are, one generation after the other, reminding of what has been committed against us, the crimes that have been committed against us, and the loss that we sustained across these years.
And as far as I understand, UN Watch lobbied to get your aunt removed from teaching. Is that correct?
They lobbied to get her sacked from her position as a head of a school.
Right.
And they said that she was a terrorist for the evidence that they used against her. The evidence that they used against her are pictures of children that wrote their original village, where they come from. So wow. Children were wearing their traditional dress in a school event, and held banners saying, we come from Haifa or Jaffa or Akka or wherever, Manshia, Brer, Simsim, all these villages that continue to live in our hearts.
Well, I think also the important thing, though, for people to understand is that UN Watch, despite its name, its name obscures quite a lot about it. The chairman of this organization is Alfred H. Moses, who is on the board of trustees for the Institute for National Security Studies, which is an Israeli military intelligence think tank. It was established in 1993, the UN Watch, by Maurice Abraham, and at that time, with what they called generous assistance of Edgar Bronfman, who was the president of the World Jewish Congress. The World Jewish Congress, of course, says explicitly that it is committed to supporting Israel and defending it against delegitimization in every sphere. The Bronfman family were essential in the establishing of the Birthright program. And also we know that today UN Watch is largely run by the American Jewish Committee, which has clear coordination with the Israeli embassy also. Mm. And in addition to that, in UN Watch's own mission statement, it says, part of our work is to combat anti-Israel bias within the UN system, which we believe hampers its ability to effectively respond to urgent human rights situations around the world. So this organization functions to deflect from criticism of Israel within the UN to other countries. It was integral and intimately involved in the establishment of a NATO no-fly zone over Libya, which of course led to the war against Libya, which destroyed the society. We also know, in addition to somebody like your aunt, who is less well known in the English-speaking world, there were the cases where UN Watch had lobbied against Gene Ziegler, Peter Hansen, Mary Robinson. These were quite high-profile employees of the United Nations, and UN Watch successfully moved these figures out of their jobs. So your experience with the Israel lobby precedes even you leaving Gaza, for example. And so if you could just tell us about the initial move by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, another organization which we will get into momentarily. This organization was the original source of complaint against you at Sheffield University. Is that correct?
Actually, they were the second that joined in line. The first was Jewish News. Interestingly, Jewish News had published their first article on Christmas Eve, informing me that I am being under investigation by my university for completely baseless charges of antisemitism. A week later, on New Year's Eve, the campaign against antisemitism joins online, and they publish, basically, they reproduce what Jewish News and the Jewish Chronicle had published about me, not just this time, but also in a previous smear campaign waged against me in 2019, when my face became one of the faces of the Boycott Eurovision campaign in Israel that was supposed to be held in Israel on Al-Manshiyah, one of the villages that Israel ethnically cleansed in 1948. And at that time, actually, interestingly, I didn't even know about the campaign against anti-Semitism in 2019. I think they started getting prominence after, or maybe they were established after 2019.
2014 is when they were established, but we'll get into them in a second. So
Okay.
the initial campaign against you was articles during the Eurovision period, and then also articles around Christmas and New Year's Eve. And so then what was the next step? What happened with Sheffield University from that point?
I was kept in the dark for nearly a month, and I was just like continuing to prepare for my teaching and the new role that I've been appointed to, and in the same time, mobilize behind the ground to avoid any punishment, or I was worried. I was actually very worried that my university would take them seriously, and eventually, on the 21st of January, my university confirms to me that they are taking them seriously, and they're investigating me based on the IHRA definition of antisemitism, because the IHRA definition of antisemitism was continuously cited in those articles against me, clearly indicating that I am in violation of the IHRA definition. But maybe we should stop here for a second and think about the IHRA definition and how it literally makes us, by definition, anti-Semites. And that's how politically motivated that is. Because, like, for example, 7 of 11 examples that are listed under the IHRA definition as potentially anti-Semitic are to do with the Israeli state. So is that definition really interested in combating anti-Jewish bigotry, or is it trying to quell criticisms of Israel and protect Israel from accountability? One of these examples clearly says that calling Israel a racist endeavor is potentially anti-Semitic, or is actually anti-Semitic. But this is what I've been shouting my whole life. This is my experience. This is the Palestinian experience. How do you justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestine when 2/3 of Palestine's indigenous people were completely dispossessed, and the rest of us remained under military rule, martial law, and in refugee camps? And how, and not to mention, of course, the massacres, Deir Yassin and Tantura, and so many others that is being now coming back to the surface, and it's just a denial that actually the IHRA definition contains a denial of our experience. and is trying to condemn the victims of racism and silence us. And if you don't, so, well, if people don't see really Israel as a racist endeavor, then really they need to educate themselves. They need to educate themselves about how the organizing principle of the Israeli state, ever since even before it came to existence, was maximum land, minimal Palestinians.
Yeah.
And then pushing as many Palestinians as possible in as minimal land as possible.
Yeah.
And this is the organizing principle of it. And this is what continues now to inform the ethnic cleansing campaigns that we see in Jerusalem, in the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and in the Jordan Valley, in the Naqab, the 35 unrecognized Palestinian villages that continue to fight with their own bodies against erasure. And even in the bombardments of Gaza, what you called mowing the lawn, isn't this also ethnic cleansing? And Gaza is a massive refugee camp. You could think of Gaza as a massive refugee camp. More than 70% of Gaza's population are refugees. They belong to what is now called Israel.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the thing is the campaign against anti-Semitism, when we take a closer look at it, is really the last organization that should be pointing fingers and talking about racism. It was established in 2014 to protect the Israeli embassy when Tricycle Theatre in Kilburn had refused to accept funding from the Israeli embassy for a film festival. We know that the organization is funded by Natan, an organization chaired by Tony Felzin, a strong supporter and donor to the Friends of the IDF. The campaign against anti-Semitism is also funded by the Jewish National Fund UK. This is an organization famous for ethnic cleansing and building settlements in occupied Palestine. Accounts for the Jewish National Fund UK show that it also has funneled funds into recruitment drives for the IDF and also to an organization called Ein Prat, a group that enlists North Americans into the Israeli army of occupation. The patrons of this organization, JNF, include the Prime Minister and President of the State of Israel, as well as Tony Blair and previously former British Prime Minister David Cameron. Now, where does it all come full circle? The chief executive and one of the founders of the campaign against anti-Semitism is Gideon Falter, who simultaneously serves as the vice chair of the JNF UK. The first director of communications for the campaign against anti-Semitism was Jonathan Sakadotti, who at the same time as that was working as a director of the Zionist Federation. Another co-founder of the campaign against anti-Semitism is Joseph Cohen, who's now gone on to head the Israel advocacy movement. Now, on its website, the campaign against anti-Semitism used to proudly announce who its honorary patrons were. They included Mark Lewis of the UK Lawyers for Israel, as we know, a lawfare lobby group who we will get into a little bit later, which works with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In addition to that, the patrons listed were also Richard Kemp, Colonel Richard Kemp, who is a close friend of Benjamin Netanyahu and has been embedded with the IDF forces in Gaza while they shot people attempting to practice their right under UN Resolution 194 to return home. Another figure on the list of patrons was the former Labour MP and member of the West Midlands Friends of Israel Steering Committee, Ian Austin. During his time as a member of Parliament, aside from relentlessly militating dramatically against Jeremy Corbyn, he also was the recipient of £58,000 from pro-Israel donors. Strangely, though, this list of honorary patrons disappeared sometime between 2019 and 2020. The question has to be asked, why is there so much secrecy around this supposedly anti-racist organization? They also played a very important role in the smearing of the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and are now pushing this war on academia, as we see in their campaign against you. Another organization that seems to have been involved in this campaign against you, Shahd, is UK Lawyers for Israel. Could you tell us a little bit about their involvement, please?
Of course. Unfortunately, I've been aware of this for quite a long time, that we have members amongst our staff at Sheffield Hallam University who are proud members of UK Lawyers for Israel. And this is no secret. They put that on their own profiles on the university. And ever since I learned this, I was like, I cannot believe. But that, you know, like for a Palestinian academic, I do understand how Western academia is part and parcel of the problem. And it is part of the chain of complicity that is allowing the normalization of Israeli oppression against the Palestinians. So I wasn't really that shocked, but in the same time, I was never safe in my university knowing this. And I've been, ever since I stepped foot in Sheffield Hallam, I was one of its most active members, organizing and, you know, speaking and campaigning and doing whatever in my capacity at campus and off campus to raise Palestinian aspirations for freedom, justice, and equality. And at times, those people would come to our events, they would hijack our events and provoke us. I remember one time we had a legally oriented event on the apartheid wall, the criminal apartheid wall that was clearly protested by so many human rights organizations, including the International Court of Justice, as a war crime. And we had a committed Palestinian filmmaker who was investigating what was going in The Hague, the conversations that was going in The Hague, this sort of fight that is going on between, you know, those supporting Israel and those who are disgusted at the continuous war crimes. And he made a really beautiful film that involved people, you know, like high-profile lawyers and at The Hague, and made a very convincing case about how even like the organizations, the international organizations that are there in place in order to hold those in power to account and protect the powerless, in this case the Palestinians, are failing the Palestinians. And when it comes to Israel, there's no accountability for whatever they do. I mean, that was basically the learning lesson of that court case. And that precise day, that exact day, I was under like extreme anxiety because I had just learned that the Israeli occupation renewed attacks against the Gaza Strip. And my family is there. And you can imagine when like you're here so far away, you know what it's like when missiles are falling on the Gaza Strip. You know, I know the horrors, the terror, the consequences, the devastation. I know it so well. And I know that people here don't understand. And this was actually one of the things that kept me frustrated in my time in exile, because I feel like people here don't understand the urgency that the Palestinians live. And like, we're talking about issues of life and death here. And she dared to justify Israel, and like made very provocative statements then. And I challenged her. That was slightly uninformally, because like it was after the event successfully finished. And I challenged her, saying, I just cannot believe that you dare to speak on behalf of Israel when they literally just bombed my family in Gaza. They bombed my hometown. And she was like, no, they're not bombing your hometown. And I was like, this is white privilege in expression. You have no clue what it's like to be at the receiving end. And of course, you can come here from Britain and say, oh, Israel is not bombing children in Gaza. And this is what they do. This is literally what they do. They ride prestigious platforms, go to academic conferences, pretend to be experts. And then they say things like, apartheid, Israeli apartheid is a trope. Israel killing children in Gaza is a trope. Everything, basically, everything that Israel has done, and even members of its own apparatus testified to it.
Yeah. I mean,
and they continue to be in denial. And they were also, and just like something very relevant to my case, they were the people that were also pushing for the IHRA to be enforced on campus.
yeah.
And guess who's affected by it first? It comes to practice for the first time against me, a Palestinian member of the university. And at that time, I was leading the student movement in opposing the university's adoption, because I thought that this wasn't about protecting Jews. This was about silencing Palestine.
And you were right.
And I was right. And I basically just demonstrated how right I was, because I was the first victim to it.
Yeah, you've clearly been vindicated. I mean, the thing with UK Lawyers for Israel is that their registered address is 3 Stone Chambers, where Jonathan Turner, who's the chief executive of UK Lawyers for Israel and one of its directors, actually is a commercial barrister. Now, previous to doing this, he was the head of the UK Zionist Federation's legal division. Other trustees of the UK Lawyers for Israel are Harvey Rose and Alan Melkman, who have been the former chair and a volunteer of the Zionist Federation. You also have Adam Levine, who is on the board of trustees for UK Lawyers for Israel. He is currently actually a registered trustee of the Henry Jackson Society. You also, on top of that, at the UK Lawyers for Israel, have Helen Pines Richmond, a conservative councillor in Barnet. On top of this, Mark Lewis, who used to be the director of the UK Lawyers for Israel, was simultaneous to that involved in the relaunch of an organization called IHRA UK, which is a Jabotinskyite right-wing Zionist revisionist organization. On top of that, we have clear evidence that UK Lawyers for Israel have some form of working relationship with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In fact, in 2011, on the official Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, you have a single post dedicated to announcing the creation of the UK Lawyers for Israel. On top of that, you've seen as recently as January 2017, the organization hosting a talk by the former Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Also in January 2013, it directly hosted and gave a platform to Arthur Lenk of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Legal Division. It co-hosted a 2-day seminar with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Israeli Embassy in London. We also know that the first and only employee of UK Lawyers for Israel in August 2015, Caroline Kendall, said that regarding the organization, we don't seek out publicity. We only want to be effective. And often it's operating below the radar and actually not publicly. Jonathan Turner, who I mentioned before, also claimed that in 2011, the flotilla ships attempting to reach Gaza were conspired against by the UK LFI, claiming that they advised Greek coastal police on the justification through a Greek lawyer, the grounds at which the ship could be stopped and arrested. Another group, an Israeli law firm that were working at that time to stop the flotilla, go by the name of Shahd Hadim, which has very close ties to the Israeli state, and in fact were revealed in a US embassy cable to take direction from Israeli intelligence services and Israel's National Security Council. So what you're dealing with when we're talking about the UK Lawyers for Israel in Sheffield is essentially an organization that lobbies on behalf of the Israeli state and has very, very close links and seemingly some form of coordination with the Israeli state. Another question I wanted to ask you is, it seems that since that point, you've also now been investigated by an organization called CAMRA. Could you tell me a little bit about the investigation that seems to have taken place by that organization?
So the latest really worrying article that came by the Jewish Chronicle, and I need to say here that I am being harassed and intimidated and defamed every week for now more than a month by the Jewish Chronicle and its allies. And it's just horrible. I have an appointment with them every week. So they have been, of course, looking into my social media posts and trying to find something that they could flag against me in order to help them help their demonization of me as not only anti-Semite but also a terrorist. And these sort of misrepresentations are not new to the Palestinians, and they're historical and systematic. And we know that they deliberately try to construct these misrepresentations in order to protect Israel from accountability and deflect attention. And part of it is also Islamophobia. And I have to stress that it's very triggering and re-traumatizing for me, because most of the things that they flag against me are tweets that I have written literally from under fire in Gaza. Most of it goes back to 2012 and 2013 when I was barely like in my early 20s and doing my BA degree and surviving multiple attacks. And I was like literally saying, "Lululi, I'm alive, and my loved ones are alive." And of course, when you're under like such extreme violence, you are going to cling to any sort of any glimpse of hope. And some of the hope for us, the hope was represented in the resistance. And this is a justified resistance led by a colonized people desperate for justice.
Yeah, Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America. This was initially how they were set up in Boston, with funding coming from the Middle East Forum, which of course is led by Greg Roman, who's a former employee of the Israeli Foreign Ministry.
They've been also trying to tarnish my reputation on Twitter, like sometimes tagging me in their posts.
Yeah.
And it's horrific, to be honest, and how insidious and manipulative they are. They, for example, say things like, claim that the Palestinian movement has no place for self-reflection, and or like we don't correct our behaviors or things like that. But actually the opposite is true. They're not leaving me alone. And they're reviving smears that were waged against me in 2019 that I've dealt with already, I've responded to already. I put them in context, and I even recognized the unintended offense that was contained in one single tweet I wrote in 2012.
Yeah.
And now with the whole reproduction of this propaganda,
but
they miss the context, they miss basic things such as
But none of these are good faith. This is about pushing you out of a job. It's about silencing you. It's about haunting you. It's about punishing you for existing, And this organization, CAMRA, which is investigating you, not only does it get money from the Middle East Forum that funds Tommy Robinson, it's also funded by the Abstraction Fund, which is led by Nina Rosenwald, who's one of the board of regents at CAMRA. Now, Nina Rosenwald is the heiress to the Vicks Vapor Rub fortune. In terms of their UK operations, they have two organizations. Comment is Free Watch, SIF Watch, which was specifically set up to police what is said in that Guardian column, Comment is Free. But then also BBC Watch, another organization set up specifically to push the BBC further and further towards a more and more pro-Israel position.
And they are also part of the same lobby groups that are trying to construct these terms that is called Islamic antisemitism. They are constructing terms like this, Islamic antisemitism and anti-Zionist antisemitism. These two terms are so dangerous.
Absolutely.
And they're racist and Islamophobic. And if people can't see that, then they need to search within their souls and educate themselves. This is so dangerous, and this is also inciting hatred and divisions, racial and ethno-religious divisions. How can we welcome such incitement in our societies? And as a Palestinian, I've always understood Palestine in the global context. And it's been always clear to me, this chain of complicity. And it does have global ramification. The injustices that are happening in Palestine have global ramifications. And we see it affecting people here, the racialized communities, the workers. And it shouldn't be accepted. Like, people should wake up to these dangers. These are real dangers, and they should be resisted. And I feel the academia should be at the forefront of this resistance in order to change narrative and to expose these ideologically constructed narratives that are made to protect Israel within academia.
Absolutely. And what you've proved so fantastically is that you will respond to this campaign with mobilizations of human beings around your cause. And it is in that anti-isolation state of mind that you have pushed back, defeated, and are continuing to fight this campaign. And the lessons that can be taken from this case of Shahd Abusalama is that you must speak out as quick as possible and gather support around you. because that's how you've been able to stave off this campaign. Were you to have remained silent for all of this time, then you would be merely giving the stage and the microphone to those who are conspiring to push you out of your job, to silence you, and to continue to haunt you as a Palestinian from Gaza, as a survivor of the Zionist war machine. So we send our salutations to you, Shahd. If there's anything else that you would like to add today.
I would really like to thank people through your platform who spoke up in my support and who advanced the hashtag in support of Shahd. I know so many people engaged with this hashtag, and you, Lowkey, was amazing in advancing this campaign as well. And I would also want to show my gratitude to my city, my home outside home, Sheffield, that was also supporting me so much during this crisis, and they continue to support me. The student movement, the UCU, my UCU branch in specific, that was leading the UCU mobilizations in my support. And now, right now, we have actually a UCU strike for equality and you know, all these sorts of things. But my case comes at the forefront of it now, because I became vulnerable not only because of my identity and the political injustices, but also there were bureaucratic and institutional injustices that basically meant I had no rights, and the university just abandoned its duties of care towards its students and staff members. And such treatment within academia shouldn't be welcomed, and it has to be resisted. And I'm just very proud of everybody who managed to make this victory possible, because this has made us actually stronger, and is going to protect future victims from such smears. And I wasn't fighting for myself. I was fighting for because I knew, and people knew, that they could have been in my case. They could have been, and I was fighting for all of these people who could have been in my shoes. And for a Palestinian who leaves tomorrow, you know, from the world's largest open-air prison in Gaza, and is met with all these contradictions outside our prison camp, that, you know, it's shocking to see it, to see the double standards, to see the hypocrisy that continues to lead in the violence against our people. We have a lot to offer, and we are not voiceless, we are not powerless. We are agents of change, and we can be so powerful and so effective if we use our voice effectively and galvanize support and build solidarity, and keep on basically pushing the momentum until we reach our South African moment and free Palestine from Israeli apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahd. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this week on the Watchdog for Mint Press. See you next time.